So yes, as AJ mentioned, my day job is to work for Rutgers University at the Eco Complex, and my family and I on the weekends have a U-Pick farm, not too far from the Eco Complex actually. And as part of that, we have a high tunnel, and high tunnels can be used for a lot of different things. I'll talk about that. But we purchased the high tunnel 3 years ago as part of a program that NRCS is funding and currently is funding more than they were back then. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. This farm, being a U-Pick farm, people want to come out typically and pick a half a dozen different things. So we find ourselves growing small lots and repetitive plantings of a lot of different crops. When you look at the different types and varieties of things we grow, we've got about 100 things on our list a year. And so part of the reason for getting the high tunnel was because we had a very difficult time finding any custom greenhouse that would plant these small lots for us and be able to keep track of it and not lose it. We kind of learned the hard way sometimes. And so we thought we'd try the high tunnel as a means of producing some of our own transplants. And we'll get a look at that. But we're open from pretty much 1st to April with crops like broccoli rabe and spinach, and then we stay open up till as late as we can in December, close to Christmas, with a lot of cool season crops late in the season. We don't currently use the high tunnels for any season extension. It's just for bedding plants, or for transplants rather. But we do hope to be able to use it in the future for that purpose. This is a shot of our high tunnel. It's 30 by 72, which at the time NRCS was funding this program was the maximum square footage that they would provide funding for. You could build a bigger greenhouse, but you wouldn't, or a high tunnel, but you wouldn't get any additional funding. And so some of the features that we liked incorporated into the greenhouse was a nice tall end doorway, roll-up doorway on both ends. That happens to be 20 feet wide, which is about as wide as you're going to get it. And even then, it was kind of flimsy. But that allowed us to bring tractors and even wagons in when we needed to for whatever purpose. And then we also liked the nice high sidewall. This is about a 6-foot height here, which gave us good ventilation when it was warm. And it made it easy to pass the trays, the transplant trays, rather than carrying them out the end of the greenhouse. You just pass them through the wall and load them on the wagon to get out in the field with it. This photo was taken last winter. We keep it covered through the year with a four-year 6-mil plastic. And you can see that the snow is just sheds along the end here. Because of the Gothic arch shape to it, it tends to shed the snow pretty nicely. But as you'll see in further slides, we eventually had some issues. But it was a good start for us. In this photo also, one of the things I wanted to mention, during the time of year when it's not being used to grow crops, in an urgent or emergency case, you can also use it for storage. If you need to run something in there to get it out of the rain, you could use it for that as well. You just have to be mindful of that when you're designing where your beds are going to be. Just some more photos of other types of high tunnel greenhouses. I'm sure that with all the presentations today, you'll see a lot of different variations on the theme. This one's a little narrower, and they're not raising the transplants in here. They're growing right in the floor. So again, you need to make sure that those doorways are big enough to get a tractor through, or at the very least a good-sized walk-behind rototiller in order to get the beds tilled up and plastic laid and so forth. This one apparently must have some electricity service to it because you see the fans here, and it does almost look like there's a double layer of poly on there. So it would almost be sort of a hybrid between a high tunnel and a conventional greenhouse to be that far along in some of the features that it has. Ours did not have electricity. Everything was manually rolled up, and we did have a water line out there, so we did have a water supply. But this is another type of high tunnel greenhouse. Some of the manufacturers are getting even a little fancier in some of the features to the high tunnel. This one happens to be a rolling high tunnel. It's kind of an interesting feature because you can actually start your crops outside. Say if this is a fall crop you're planting, You could have a lettuce crop or carrots, something that could take some cold weather, just planted outside. And then as your warm season crop kind of finishes up, in this section of the field, this whole greenhouse just rolls on these pipes. You see that pipe that's along the edge of the bed there, and that allows you to move that greenhouse to another part of the field to protect the cool season crop and get your season extension from that. And it's without a large additional investment of capital to do that. We don't have something like that. I don't think that we would go that far yet. You may almost be better just building a longer greenhouse in the end. It's something that you need to decide on your own depending on what your uses are going to be. I wanted to just cover, even though we don't do this ourselves as some of the crops that could be grown in a high tunnel, I wanted to cover what some of the good candidate crops are that you might consider if you want to do longer season extension, or if you want to do some crops that are very sensitive to the rain and weather. So here's a list of general categories. So you have your high yielding warm season crops. The ones that have high retail prices are typically the good candidates, and the ones that are really sensitive to rain. So that would include things like tomatoes, especially heirloom tomatoes. Bob Muth, who many of you probably know, does a lot of heirloom tomatoes in high tunnels on his farm. It works really good for him. Peppers, because of rain issues with the peppers, the way that they check up when you get a lot of rain on them. Cucumbers, eggplant, squash, and herbs. Herbs are also another good candidate and are warm season crops. Usually on those types of crops, you'll get a month earlier harvest in the spring and a month into the fall a little bit further either. So you kind of get a month on either side of the main season. Then you have your cool season crops. This is what I think is a really good fit for high tunnels. And that would include things like lettuce, baby greens, spinach, your cole crops, Swiss chard. Just last week, as part of the Ultra Niche Crops program, what's her name, Meredith? Jess Niedermer. Yeah, she gave a really good presentation of high tunnel lettuce production through the winter. So an unheated high tunnel greenhouse, she can harvest lettuce right up through early March. And it's by using things like floating row covers and pulling them in the evening hours when it gets really cold to protect the crop and keep the warmth of the soil close to the crop. So again, these houses aren't heated. There's no electricity. All that's being done manually, but it also is being done at a fairly low cost when you look at the production cost. Small fruit is another big area that we'll probably hear a lot more about today. That includes strawberries, raspberries, currants, cherries. I saw a high tunnel greenhouse with cherries. It was about 15 feet high. You have to accommodate the height of the crop, but it can be done. And then vegetable transplants, like the types we were growing, we can start the transplants about a month earlier than you would be able to direct seed them in the field. So if you're going to plant cabbage transplants, you can start in early April rather than the end of April. Even into late March. And some of those crops, even if the trays freeze at night, because that'll happen, planting into the cooler parts of the year, it really doesn't harm the crop if the plants are just starting to come up. These cool season crops can take that. They actually experience it when they're growing in the field. It's just that the plants take it a little bit longer to get to a point where you can pull them and transplant. So we generally see about a 2-week extension in time versus greenhouse production when you use a high tunnel to grow your transplants. We also were rooting strawberry tips. We have a U-pick strawberry field. And so we were buying the unrooted tips, rooting them in the greenhouse under mist. It was during a time of the year which was pretty much from early August to late August, a time of year when we weren't really using the house that much for other purposes, so it was a good fit for us. And then you also have ornamental crops that can be grown in the greenhouse or the high tunnel. And that would be things like bedding plants and cut flowers and so forth. So they are very versatile. There's a lot of different things they can be used for. It's also good to see that NRCS recognizes this, especially for intensive, either direct market farms or wholesale farms that are growing tender crops. These are all really good reasons why you might want to consider high tunnels in your production system. So the first high tunnel that we built, again, I mentioned, was this 30 by 72 with 6-foot sidewalls, 14-foot peak, and with the wood that we had to buy that goes along the edges for the part where the roll-up sides attaches to at the bending point in the greenhouse, as well as at the base. Altogether, for construction, which was about $1,000, we invested a total of this $9,500. At the time, back in 2013, NRCS was providing this dollar amount. Now that number varies depending on what state you're in. So if you're not from New Jersey, that number's different, and actually today, that number's different than it was 4 years ago. So anyway, we received that much from NRCS, which gave us a total cost of about $4,000 for the high tunnel. Pretty reasonable when you think of how versatile it is and what it added to the production. Now, in talking to NRCS just recently, they have expanded the program. So now the level goes up to $13,000, but in order to get that much money, you have to install at least 4,300 square feet. And if you already have a 2,100 square foot from funding before, you still qualify for the difference. So there is the ability to go back and get some additional funding for that. Some of the advantages of a high tunnel over field production and even greenhouse production: improved growth, quality, and yield off your crop, increased revenue per unit area. That's always important when you're space limited. Extended growing season with the possibility of year-round production for cool season crops. More predictable timing and yield versus field production, because you don't have the impact of adverse weather that may ruin yields in some of the crops that you're growing outside. Earlier and also later harvests typically are sold at higher prices, so the price for your product at wholesale or retail levels are higher. Protection from the elements, and that's one of the key advantages to the high tunnels: rain, wind, hail, snow. Excessive sun, and I should also say excessive cold too. Obviously, that's one of the big advantages. You can plant, harvest seed regardless of what the weather is outside. That's also important when you have these crops at every 2 weeks, like with baby lettuce or some of the other greens. Has to be done on a pretty regular schedule, or else you have gaps. The high tunnel will increase the soil temperature of the soil within the greenhouse. Reduced rain-related diseases and disorders is a big one for some of your warm season crops and strawberries. This next one, kind of an interesting thing that we noticed with our high tunnel, is that we can exclude the deer, rabbits, and birds and other animals from getting into the greenhouse. However, our sidewalls rolled up from the bottom, so if we were doing just a little bit of cooling, somehow the groundhogs learned that they could get in underneath of it. And so they were getting into the sides, and we had to install a short metal fence just around the base so that if we had it venting like just a foot, the groundhogs wouldn't get in there and eat some of the transplants. They just, I guess, like the tender greens that are growing inside a high tunnel. Never had trouble with deer, but we did have rabbits in there as well. You can install a high tunnel where you don't have electricity. That's a big advantage over a greenhouse. This farm that we installed our high tunnel on, we had purchased just 2 years before that. Up until that time, it was just a grain farm, and the electricity only came up to the barnyard, and that was not where we had the space for the high tunnel. So we couldn't even consider putting in a greenhouse that needed electricity for an inflation fan and for heating and exhaust. But a high tunnel, because of its design and the ability to do it without electricity, was a good fit. And then also potentially there's the possibility it can reduce food safety issues. That would be because you're keeping animals out of the places confined. It doesn't eliminate the problem because you still have your workers you need to be concerned about, but at least it does restrict some of the exposure to wildlife. So what are some of the disadvantages? We had a nice long list of advantages. Some of the disadvantages are the high initial cost, but it's not as high as a greenhouse. It also, with the NRCS funding, is a pretty reasonable price. It requires more management time. When you have a crop in there, and you're at the time of year when it's cold outside, but you've got to ventilate. You need to have somebody around that can go and open the vent in the morning. If it gets cloudy, you might want them to close the vent a little bit midday, or close it up at night. But it's not like you can go away for a week and nobody there to look at it. Not that you would be able to do that with a greenhouse either, but in this case, you really do have to have somebody who, in 15 minutes notice can go and move things around, open the doors, or shut them as necessary if you're trying to control your temperature inside. It does favor certain insects and disease that thrive inside a protected environment. So these insects would be the types that you might find inside of a greenhouse as well. Things like mites and thrips and aphids to some extent would all tend to survive better in a high tunnel, so you need to be mindful of that. One of the things that we did in our high tunnel with the big doorways on either end is that we made sure that the center aisle was wide enough for one of our narrow tractors to get down with a sprayer. And so if we were spraying something in the field on a crop that would work for our transplants, we would just drive the tractor through there too. Certainly makes the time to apply any pesticides a lot quicker. It's too hot in the summer for some crops, but you can purchase a shade cloth if you want to try and keep that house a little bit cooler. And because you probably have a water supply to the greenhouse, you might even consider some type of mist. We used the mist to root our strawberry crops, and that did help cool the greenhouse down a little bit, but maybe something like that might work for other crops as well. So I want to talk a little bit about high tunnel, and I know AJ's in the last presentation is going to talk about high tunnel design. I talked about our high tunnel in the past a little bit because this past summer we had a storm come through. It was just in early July, and we ended up losing the greenhouse. So here's a picture before, the one that I showed you. Here's a picture right after. And it went through three winters of snow without a problem. But that one windstorm, in a matter of minutes, took her down. And you can see in this picture here, we had a crop of leeks ready to go out and another crop of fennel that fortunately we were able to salvage. But there was other cole crops and other things behind that that didn't make it because the greenhouse actually came down and squished the crop. So I wanted to show you this because it's one of the important things. You'll find when you start looking for high tunnels, if you decide to do it, that there is a whole array of different strengths. Some of the manufacturers say, do not keep plastic on our structures in the winter. You know you've got a pretty light framework when they say that. This was made to stay covered through the winter. So if you have one that's made to stay covered through the winter, then there's some additional things you need to look for. And in this case, I think it was the design. This was kind of a greenhouse that was shipped to us, so they wanted to keep all the pipe lengths fairly short to minimize shipping costs. So we had a lot of pieces that were like dovetailed together or a swage fitting that they fit into one another, and that ended up being some weak points in the design. What happened, essentially, you got to remember that with the plastic covering that's curved over the top, when you have a high wind coming across it, it almost acts like an airplane wing. And so that greenhouse or high tunnel actually wants to lift up, not get pushed down or pushed sideways. So what really happened, let me see here. You can see the posts that are along this side. They were about 4 feet over this way when the windstorm came through. And this was on the leeward side. So this was on the back side of the house that wasn't getting the wind hitting it, but it was being pulled up out of the ground. And as it did, what it basically did was stretch the greenhouse. You can see here. Might be a little hard to see, but those pipes that were pulled out of the ground on the far side, the pipes that were part of the arch were stretched to the point where they failed. And they came down in the middle, and that's when it crushed the crop that was down below. One of the things that you don't see in this greenhouse, and again it was because we were trying to get a high tunnel at a fairly low cost, is what are called trusses. So that would be pipes that kind of tie one side of the arch to the other. They just go straight across. They're actually kind of handy if you have a greenhouse, you hang a lot of hanging baskets on it and stuff. It did have purlins that stopped the movement from the ends of the greenhouse, but it didn't have trusses to stop the sideward motion. And so We ended up taking this greenhouse down. There was no way it could be salvaged. And fortunately, we did have it insured for wind. The insurance company wouldn't cover it for snow, but they did cover it for wind. And we just ordered another greenhouse that we're getting ready to start putting back up again to replace this one. So just something to consider. With all these different types of high tunnels that are out there now, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to bother uncovering it every winter, or do you want to get a four-year plastic like we did and try and use it for 4 years before it has to be recovered? And so anyway, just a couple of conclusions. High tunnels are a useful tool for a lot of different reasons. Definitely something I would encourage you to think about it in your operation. They have a very low energy input, and they're very good for sustainable agriculture practices. That's a buzzword that you start to hear more and more now. Consumers want to hear that what you're doing on your farm is sustainable, that you're not using a lot of energy and a lot of fertilizer, a lot of chemicals to grow the crop that aren't necessary. Whereas greenhouses sometimes are questionable in how much energy they use to grow a crop. High tunnels don't have heat. So you still have energy in the structure and in the plastic to cover it, but you don't have that heat that also adds up to the total sustainable picture. So it's definitely something that as an organic farmer or just even sustainable ag, you might want to try and consider so you could play that up in your marketing. Check with other growers on which high tunnels they've had success. I found that was pretty useful for us after we had the problem this past summer. I talked to a couple of guys that have other versions, other manufacturers, and some of them, as we called around, were about the same price, but they're a lot stronger house. So it's definitely worth looking into. And be careful to purchase that strong structure. And check with your insurance company for the type of coverage that you might be able to get. You might have a company that will cover it for snow. Ours didn't, but they did cover it for wind. See what they would charge you for insuring that facility, and if you think it's worth it, I'd definitely suggest considering that. I believe that's it. If you have more interest in what's going on at the farm, just go to this Facebook page, Specka Farms, pick your own. We have a lot of information there for it as well.